They told us this hearing was about fraud in Minnesota, but what Sheldon Whitehouse just exposed is something way bigger and way more dangerous. A government being bent to protect corruption, silence prosecutors, and sell out the public while Ted Cruz tries to change the subject. Stay with me because this goes to the heart of what's broken in American politics right now.
What a strange thing it is to have a hearing about Minnesota that doesn't address what's on the front pages of every newspaper about Minnesota: the violent and unwelcome federal occupation of its largest city by the chairman's political party, an occupation that has already caused the deaths at federal agents' hands of 2 American citizens and left many more injured, and that is roundly criticized by law enforcement leaders, including those in Texas, as unprofessional and dangerous. That may explain why elected officials in Minnesota have something better to do today. No mention today of 100 violations by agents there of federal court orders. No mention of the sacking of the vain little commander of that operation. No mention of the venomous lies told by Secretary Noem about the shooting victims without investigation or sympathy as their bereaved families grappled with grief at their deaths. I've done law enforcement briefings, and rule 1 is to tell the truth. What a strange thing it is to have a hearing about fraud in Minnesota that doesn't acknowledge that the wide-ranging investigation and prosecutions of $9 billion worth of fraud in that state began years ago under the Biden administration. No mention of the fact that the current administration drove out the career prosecutor leading those cases when it demanded he investigate the victim of an ICE shooting, not the agent who did the shooting. 14 prosecutors have left the Minnesota U.S. Attorney's Office in the past month. And what a strange thing it is to have a hearing about fraud that doesn't look at the colossal fraud perpetrated by this administration, starting with the president's own conviction of 34 felony fraud counts, the dismissal of inspectors general who watch out for fraud, the destruction of the Justice Department components that prevent and prosecute corruption, the self-serving billion-dollar crypto deals that line the pockets of the president and his family, the pay-to-play presidential pardons that strip fraud victims of their restitution, the disabling of consumer protection offices and regulators that defend the public against fraud. It is a carnival of fraud and self-dealing. On top of all this, the biggest fraud ever perpetrated in America is going on right now, facilitated and accelerated by the Trump administration, and implemented through a massive, semi-covert climate denial fraud operation and a twinned, massive, semi-covert dark money political corruption operation. This fraud costs Americans hundreds of billions of dollars every year, $770 billion annually, according to the International Monetary Fund, $820 billion annually in healthcare costs from another report. Climate-related disasters cost the United States $115 billion last year. How was this fraud done? This long-running fraud operation began when oil industry scientists reported to their bosses the dangers of fossil fuel pollution, and instead of responsible stewardship, the bosses hid the reports. That was stage one. Stage two moved from hiding to purposefully misleading. A federal court shut down Big Tobacco's fraud operation to mislead the public about the dangers of tobacco. That tobacco fraud operation was quickly repurposed by Big Oil into its own fraud operation to mislead the public about the dangers of its product. Stage three kicked off with Citizens United, which gave the fossil fuel industry the ability to spend unlimited amounts of political money and spend it secretly. This dark money political corruption operation swiftly strangled bipartisanship on climate. Before stage three, there were multiple bipartisan climate bills in the Senate, and John McCain ran for president on a legitimate climate platform. All of that was killed by fossil fuel dark money. Now we're in the most dangerous stage, where the corruption is so entrenched that the fossil fuel industry can infiltrate and weaponize the federal government as its own industry tool to defeat energy competitors whose product is cleaner, safer, and cheaper. But no Republican dares talk about that problem any longer. Such is the party's dependence on those big fossil fuel donors. President Trump asked the fossil fuel companies for a $1 billion campaign slush fund in 2024, and they expect and got a return on their investment. Quid pro quo. The lies and fraud are legion, but to use just one Rhode Island-based example, senior cabinet officials continually assert that offshore wind is unaffordable when the opposite is true. Anyone reading the contract can see that Revolution Wind will bring 9.9 cent kilowatt hours to an 18 cent kilowatt hour grid. The administration's weaponized attacks, rejected as pretextual, went 0 for 5 in federal court, including before a Trump appointee. Instead of focusing on this massive fraud or holding the administration accountable for the monumental levels of fraud and corruption in its own ranks, a Texas chairman holds a hearing on fraud in Minnesota, which is neither the biggest issue in Minnesota nor the biggest example of fraud. There's a biblical saying about the mote in another's eye and the beam in your own from the Sermon on the Mount. Why beholdest thou the mote that is in thy brother's eye, but considerest not the beam that is in thine own? Asked Jesus. I will leave it at that.
I want to commend my Democrat colleagues for giving an ode to Homer Simpson. When something is distracting, scream, squirrel! Because we saw a speech about global warming. We saw a speech about Orange Man bad. We saw a speech about how today's Democrat Party exists seemingly exclusively to defend violent criminal illegal aliens and to demonize law enforcement. And yet, miraculously, in that enormous word cloud, virtually nothing about $9 billion stolen from Minnesota taxpayers by Somali fraudsters, with Democrat politicians knowing full well what is happening, facilitating it, and harvesting votes and campaign dollars from the people robbing the children of Minnesota. My Democrat colleagues want you desperately not to focus on those facts. And so instead, miraculously, the Democrats have discovered the Sermon on the Mount. Well, this hearing is going to focus on $9 billion stolen from the taxpayers, and hundreds of millions of those dollars going to the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization funded by the Democrats. As much as my colleagues on that side of the aisle don't want to talk about it. With that, I recognize the chairman of the full committee, Chairman Grassley.
Senator Cruz, thank you for...
What you're about to see isn't just a clash of personalities in the Senate. It's a clash between two completely different ideas of what government is supposed to be. Sheldon Whitehouse walks into this hearing and basically rips the mask off the whole operation, pointing out that you can't pretend to care about fraud while ignoring dead civilians, sidelined prosecutors, fired watchdogs, and a White House that's swimming in conflicts of interest. He doesn't just talk about one scandal or one state. He connects the dots between political interference in law enforcement, the gutting of anti-corruption institutions, and the massive, decades-long fraud campaign that's been run on the American people about climate change and corporate power. And then Ted Cruz responds, not by actually engaging with those facts, but by doing what today's Republican Party does best: deflect, inflame, and distract. This isn't just about Minnesota. It's about whether the United States is going to be a country where the powerful are held accountable, or one where they can buy protection, rewrite reality, and dare anyone to stop them.